I would like you to welcome our next speaker, Professor Heather Widdows. Heather is Professor of Global Ethics at the Philosophy Department of the University of Birmingham, and Heather is going to talk to us about happiness and perfection. So please welcome Professor Heather Widdows.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to begin just by thanking you for coming out in the rain. It's always a great privilege for people to be willing to take time out of their busy lives to hear the stuff that I might happen to think. And I've got quite an act to follow today. As a jobbing academic, this is not my comfort zone. My comfort zone is in my pyjamas, hiding in my study with my laptop, so do bear with me. Given this, why am I here today? Well, it's because I think this topic, the topic of beauty and perfection, is important and it needs to be taken much more seriously than it is. So my aim today is that even if you don't agree with my take on beauty, or what I think it might have to do with happiness, that I will convince you that this isn't trivial or unimportant, but a significant contributor to, or detractor from, happiness and well-being. So my talk today isn't on happiness as such, but on beauty, and particularly the dominant ideal of beauty which surrounds us. And for many people, these are not only connected, but identical. Now, I hope to finish within my hour, so we'll have some time to discuss afterwards. We're a little late starting, but we should still have some time. So, philosophically, occasionally beauty has been associated with the human body, but usually in some idealized and essentially inhuman way. So, if you think about the Athenian perfect youth, or as a symbol for something else, so beautiful women representing the virtues. But the moral philosophy of beauty as a moral ideal, which applies to real women and increasingly men, and to their smelly, hairy, saggy, and ever-changing human bodies, has not really been done. And this is a gap, and a significant gap. To focus on beauty only as something separate and disconnected from human bodies is to miss where beauty ideals are their strongest in contemporary society, and where they are their most active in the day-to-day lives of real human beings like you and me. It is not too strong a claim to say that for many, their self-esteem, their well-being, their happiness is tied up very directly with the extent to which they think they conform to the beauty ideal. And to treat this aspect of beauty as trivial, as most philosophy does, is to fail to recognise what is going on in the power of this ideal. So my view is that if philosophy wants to continue what it has traditionally done, to address core questions of meaning, questions such as what are human beings, what is the self, what gives meaning to life, and what makes life good, then thinking philosophically how beauty ideals function and how they should function is anything but trivial. It is, in fact, a dominating contemporary ideal, and indeed for some people, it is the ideal. It is an ideal by which we judge ourselves and other people, and while women might be particularly guilty here, do not doubt that this is applying to more and more men. And to some men, it is as definitive already as it is to some women. So it's this ideal and how it functions that I'm exploring in the book that I'm writing called Perfect Me. And this ideal acts in a number of connected but distinguishable ways. And the three ways that I'm particularly concerned of as first, as an individual's aspiration to perfect themselves, I want to be perfect, a value judgment that this type of beauty is worth having, that it will make you happy. Second, as an assertion of what being perfect is, this is what I would be if I were perfect. a judgment about what this type of perfect amounts to. And third, as a command that you should obey. You should be perfect, a moral imperative, something required of us. So today I'm just going to give you a taster of this project. I'm at the beginning of it, and what I say now may not end up in the book. I'm going to talk about what the ideal of beauty is, outline the scope of this, and finally I'm going to tell you about 3 of the main arguments that I'm planning to make at this point in the book. So in terms of today's topic of happiness, my focus is indirect. When asked to speak today, I said I'd have to do it this way round if I was going to speak at all. But these topics are closely connected, at least in the minds and expectations of those who are seeking to achieve this ideal. So first then, what is the contemporary ideal of beauty? What is that perfect you or perfect me? If I was teaching right now, I would ask the students to have a quick brainstorm and give me a long list of what would be the perfect them. So I'm not going to put you on the spot right now, but do take a second to think how you would respond. What would be the top 3 things that you put on a list to perfect yourself? What would make you a more perfect you? Now, think of how many of these are connected to body image. For some of you, none will be. But in a group of my students, I have never yet done that and not had at least one be about body image. After having brainstormed that, I would then look at the things they told me about what that perfect body image ideal was. And these are the kind of things that would end up on the list, in no particular order. But these things would always be there. Being thin and or slim, being smooth and hairless, being golden skinned, being firm, not wobbly. You're allowed not to be skinny, but only if you're firm. So strong is the new sexy. And my students tell me that I really need to embrace the word buff for this list. And importantly, young looking. Not saggy, not wrinkly, not distinguished. Youth is key to this ideal of beauty. So as a beauty ideal, this is something that affects how girls, and increasingly women, judge themselves, measure themselves, and believe themselves happy and successful. Now, of course, some individuals do better at resisting this than others do. And arguably, younger girls and younger women are more susceptible than older women. Although women across the age range report unhappiness with their bodies, and body image features significantly as they report their own happiness. And it does start particularly young. If you look at the research that has been done, not by me, I'm a philosopher, I'm not a psychologist, I let psychologists do the interviews, but 1 in 5 girls of primary school age, so 7 to 11, have been on a diet already, and this rises to over half in secondary schools. And perhaps more significantly, they believe that it is important, with 87% of 11 to 21-year-olds saying that women are judged more on their appearance than on their ability. So that is nearly 90% of girls and young women who believe that how they look and will matter more than what they can do or what they will say. So given this, it's not surprising that over 70% of them want to lose weight. And before anyone says those are just some scarce statistics of the type which might be unscrupulously used to create a good headline, these figures I took from the 2013 Girls' Attitude Survey, which was conducted by that radical pressure group, the Girl Guides. So statistics are not my stock in trade, and of course they can be misused. But if you look at the studies, of which there are very many, the messages are broadly the same. People think, especially young girls, that appearance matters. And if you think of your own experience, that of your wives, your friends, your daughters and your sisters, very few of us are not influenced to some degree by this powerful ideal. So it is against this ideal of thinness, youth, and firmness that individuals construct their identity, judge themselves, and estimate their success, and effectively determine how worthy or valuable they are. They also judge others with regard to how far they meet the ideal and place themselves relative to others. So this provides some shared social standards and norms, and it is an ideal which punishes deviation. And this is true externally and internally. Externally, non-conformity with the ideal results in less employment and other opportunities, and the evidence does suggest that good looks result in more interviews and higher salaries. And internally, women beat up on themselves if they think they aren't good enough. They are unhappy with how they look, by which they often understand being unhappy with themselves. So as such, the beauty ideal becomes a value framework, an ideal standard against which individuals judge their own and others' progress, success, and failure. So for some, the ideal of being perfect is all-encompassing, whereas for others it is much less invasive, rejected or balanced by other goods and ideals, but for very few is it wholly irrelevant. Individuals feel happy when they attain some aspect of it. For instance, when they've reached their goal weight, filled their wrinkles, or firmed their thighs. That beauty functions in this way for many people isn't particularly controversial. Most of us recognise some of these influences in our own experience, even though we might wish that we didn't. The assumptions which connect our more perfect selves, our improved bodies, with a better, more happier self, are deeply ingrained. We often hear language that suggests we should strive for this. Phrases such as your best self, or the best you can be, or it's still you, just the best version of you. This is language that is saturated with value. It is exceptionally value-laden. It is fundamentally moral language, and it carries in it words like should, ought, and worth. We should live up to the ideal because you're worth it. You owe it to yourself. And conversely, if you don't strive for this, then you're culpable and blameworthy. You let yourself go, and presumably you're not worth it. So when you start looking at this more critically, it stops being trivial. These are carriers of praise and blame and judgment, and they seem to be everywhere. And this is where beauty, happiness, success, and goodness begin to rhetorically merge. The more perfect you are, the happier you will be, the better you will be. Here are a few examples. The more beautiful you are, the better job you will get. So, advice like, look the part, or dress for the job you want, not the job you have, is common. I was once given this advice, although in my case it was particularly appalling advice, as the job I wanted was to be a philosophy professor. There was no way, frankly, that adjusting my clothing to emulate the nearly exclusively male, and forgive me, badly dressed, professorate that I aspired to was going to help me achieve my end. But in lots of other instances, the example does work. My second example is the presumption of much, even most, advertising aimed at women. The more perfect you are, the more attractive you will be, and the more likely you are to have good relationships and to be happy. Things like, if I'm thinner, prettier, sexier, he'll love me more. If only I had looked after myself better, he wouldn't have left. Back to the letting yourself go trope. The implication that how thin, young, and beautiful you are is primary in determining the extent to which you should be loved, not whether you are kind, or fun, or a good friend, a great mother, daughter, wife, or girlfriend, but just whether you look the part. You hear this too in language about wives being traded up for a younger model, as if all that is valuable in a person or in the relationship is how they appear in the role that they have cast themselves in or been cast in. So in general, the assumption is that the more we fit the ideal, the happier we will be. And these assumptions clearly flow through the decisions that people make. So in another recent survey, only 12% of women reported being happy with their body size, with 77% saying that shape played a primary role in their evaluation of themselves, and that's spread across the age range. And in another study, 68% said that they always or often think about their body and make decisions on diet and exercise based on looks and not on health, although they admitted they sometimes claimed to other people that it was about health. So according to this ideal then, the more perfect I am, the more I will be rewarded. I will have a better job, better relationships, I'll be more loved, I'll be happier. It's a powerful ideal which provides goals and standards to aspire to. And this is why it has to be taken seriously and critiqued. Kate Moss's now famous or infamous motto of nothing tastes as good as skinny feels sums this up and is ingrained. So that's the ideal then, thin, young, firm, smooth. And it is embedded in contemporary assumptions about beauty and the constant messages that surround us. So, what am I doing in my work at looking at this ideal? Well, first of all, let me tell you about some of the scope. What am I considering? Well, I'm considering pretty much all beauty practices. I'm looking at what are often thought of as normal and minimal requirements of the beauty ideal, including practices such as continual removal of some, or often most, body hair, routine hair colouring and daily styling, daily application of skincare products, cosmetics and perfume, and general body maintenance via dieting and exercise. I'm also looking at what have been termed more extreme aspects of conforming to the ideal of perfection, including cosmetic procedures and extreme forms of dieting, body modification and exercise. So I'm kind of including everything beauty related, but in a very unsystematic way, because my focus is on what's going on underneath. So I'm not looking at beauty practices separately and arguing for the ethics of individual practices. Because I think that what is most neglected is not the need to improve regulation and safety, but the ideal and why we're here in the first place. But it is easy to get sidetracked by specifics. So if you look at some of the facts, and again, I'm back to statistics again, they are just so startling. So half of girls and women aged 16 to 21 would consider plastic surgery. Half of girls aged 3 to 6, so that's younger than my 7-year-old sitting at the front watching 101. Oh no, she's reading Harry Potter now, and now I've embarrassed her. You have to get used to it, sweetie. They are worried about their weight, and a third already want to change weight or hair colour. 3 to 6. And the American Society of Plastic Surgeons recorded a total of 236,306 cosmetic surgical procedures and cosmetic minimally invasive procedures performed on people aged between 13 and 19 in 2012. So 1 year, 13 to 19 age group. So I'm not saying that regulating this isn't important, it is, and I do work on this elsewhere. But right now, and in the book, I'm not looking at how to make what we have safer or improved, but I'm rather looking at why we have it at all. We wouldn't have arguments about whether Botox should be better regulated if we collectively rejected the view that looking young was something that mattered. So you might consider the list of beauty practices that I just gave, from makeup and skincare to surgery to extreme forms of diet and exercise. And you might think, yes, of course, that's all connected. I can see why she thinks there's a beauty ideal here. Others of you might think that some of these practices are problematic and they worry you, but others are completely routine and not worrying. And others of you might think all of it's fine, as long as you can afford it and you know what you're getting into. And often what happens when I talk about this is that you'll want to defend the practices that you do and think are essential to how you look, and then you'll think other things are extreme and part of this ideal. And the line is drawn in very different places for different people. So, for example, if you've had surgery for appearance reasons, or if you consider having it, you're much more likely to think it's benign, and if not, not. And this is also true of non-invasive procedures. So take a moment to recognise your first response of where you draw that line, what you think is okay and what you think isn't. And then wherever you fall on that spectrum, question your views from a different point on the spectrum. So to set this in context, if you think historically about how makeup has been treated, so fairly recently, makeup was absolutely not permitted for respectable women. Hence so much talk about cheek pinching and lip biting in 19th century novels. But now the norm is for most women to wear some makeup. So hence campaigns like the recent barefaced selfies, where women posted barefaced, no makeup pictures in order to raise money for charity. So this is fundraising precisely because it's not normal to see most women without makeup. And it's even considered brave, and that's why people are willing to donate money to charity when they do it. Or think of the hair dye, where the trajectory is even more stark. So my mother does not have dyed hair. I do, and have done since I was about 15, although at that point it was pink. And increasingly, it's not only normal to dye your hair, but it's often required when you reach a certain age, and certainly in some professions. Now, of course, this does not mean that it's required everywhere. Factors like demographics, class, religion, and region all play parts, as they always do. But here, the overall norm is shifting, and it's shifting to something that is more demanding in terms of time, effort, and of course, money. Another area where the norm has shifted significantly and quickly, and one which I talk about a lot because I think it's both symbolic and revealing, is body hair. It's now the norm to be increasingly hairless. In public, at the beach, at a swimming pool, or on a night out, many women think that defluffing, again I got that from my students, is routine, like washing or teeth cleaning. But it's not that long ago, and certainly when I was an undergraduate, when underarm hair was a fashion choice, acceptable and even attractive. A fashion choice, not a norm. So changes in norms with regard to pubic hair are equally striking, and not just in porn, where the 70s norm was lots of hair and now it's no hair, but the extent to which public hair is routinely tamed, and this taming is seen as normal, tracks to age and goes up starkly. I ask my students, and none would go to a swimming pool or the beach without removing underarm hair, leg hair, and some or all pubic hair. Obviously, that's not a scientific survey. But, you know, I mean, I've been an interesting dinner guest since I started this project. It's hard to find men under 40 who've seen women's underarm hair. And it's very common in men over 40. Try it on pubic hair in your children's. Yeah. It works too. I haven't come up with an age for that one yet. So in future, what will be required? What will my daughter down here have to do? So 3 quick further comments before I move to the arguments. First, what is normal and routine and what is considered extreme is continually shifting. What was normal for me was not normal for my mother, and I don't know what will turn out to be normal for Clara. So this is why we can't look at practices in isolation, because the aim is to consider what's really going on. For Becky Sharp, a bit of lipstick would have been shocking, but for us, it is normal. And it's required of most of us in most contexts. So our norms are very socially constructed and they are moving fast. Second, I'm less and less sure about what is normal and routine. So if we consider makeup, hair dye and body hair as examples, they begin to look from some angles, at least, as a little extreme, and they certainly would have been judged so by previous generations. I also wonder about things like the requirement for hair removal and what's normal amongst a young demographic, as whether this isn't already very extreme if you consider the time and often in many methods the significant pain involved. It's not clear to me that something like continual waxing might not be more extreme than surgery is. The practices are different. Surgery is exceptionally demanding for a short period of time, whereas hair removal is moderately demanding, but continually and over significant time. So my third and final point before I crack on is that so far this might be uncomfortable for some people. Most of us engage in some of this stuff, and often the lines we place between what we engage in and what we think is problematic is about what we do, and it's very easy to feel criticised when the practices we engage in, and in some instances enjoy, not waxing. Anybody who enjoys waxing, I'm disassociating myself, but going to the hairdressers, putting on makeup, these are practices that many of us enjoy. So if you're feeling individually criticised, please don't. By contrast, some of you may not engage in any of these practices and might be feeling superior or even smug. Please don't feel that either. As I'm going to go on to say, this really isn't about individuals. I'm not trying to criticise individuals for what they do. This is about social and shared ideals and norms, and much less about choice than you might think. We don't choose our norms or our beauty ideals. And just in case I've missed anyone, maybe the men in the audience, while I'll grant you that so far the ideal might have been less demanding for most, not all, but most men, this is coming your way. If you go and look up the statistics on male waxing, and I'm not going to give you the colloquial name now because it's being recorded and I'm not sure my university would approve, but I'm sure you know the term. So it is on the rise dramatically, and it is very likely other aspects of the beauty ideal will come that way too. Okay, so that's my final point on that. Please, this is not individual. Don't feel threatened or criticised or any of those things. So for the rest of my time, I want to talk to you about three of the arguments that I'm developing in the book. First, about the ubiquity and dominance of the contemporary ideal, which I think is different from past ideals. Second, about what it implies for understandings of the self. And finally, about why choice and consent arguments don't work here, and why we can't rely on these to produce anything vaguely ethical. The first argument, then, is that the beauty ideal is becoming more dominant, pervasive, and ubiquitous. That what beauty requires is more than it used to be, and it's required of more people. It is harder to resist, more types of women and men in more places, and potentially globally. So I've already outlined the ways that it might be more demanding using examples of hair dye and body hair. It takes more time to be normal, and it takes time, effort, and money beyond what was done in a previous generation. So while aspiring to some kind of physical perfection and ideal of beauty is not new, of course not, what we're now doing is, and it is expected to some degree or another of all women, and countercultures and subverting these norms is increasingly ineffective and problematic if you want to succeed in mainstream society. Moreover, as possibilities of achieving this, technical, surgical, and chemical, increase, so does the pressure that people feel and the expectations put on them. Unlike many previous ideals of beauty, attainment of the current ideal of perfection is less and less likely without the intervention of technology. To be large-breasted and skinny requires some intervention. and minimal self-grooming is no longer required. For many of us, at least normally, hair dye at a certain age and some minimal makeup is required to go to work. It is not hard to imagine that youth-mimicking procedures could become standard in the not too distant future, and those who do not comply will gradually become seen as more abnormal and may suffer economically and socially for their non-compliance, as we see those who don't comply do already. So as well as being more demanding, I think it now applies to more types of women. It's not only expected that a certain type of woman, perhaps somebody in the beauty business or in the acting business or needing it for their career, would require it. When you think about how women in the public sphere, in areas where being beautiful isn't material to their performance, so think about famous lawyers or sportswomen or politicians or almost any woman in the public eye, and media coverage will invariably comment on how they look, irrespective of why they are in the public eye. So I haven't tested this out yet, and I probably won't, but I'm sure that if you did get all the column inches on Hillary Clinton, you may find as many about her dress sense and hair as you would about her political role. So as extreme as this might be, it doesn't stop with women in the public eye. It applies to the rest of us too. So fashion at the school gate, good and bad, is now featuring in lots of magazines and on lots of websites. So even the daily task of school drop-off and pick-up becomes a moment of judgment. And the means and methods of this type of judgment, with the opportunity of social media, now expand. Women and girls, and with girls this can be particularly devastating, are judged and liked according to how they look. And the profiles that are created and the selfies that are posted are a way to package and present themselves purely according to the ideal. It also applies to more women globally as beauty ideals become homogenised and standardised and less variety is permitted. So often claims of beauty norms being global are rejected on the grounds that there are some cultural differences, with fatter women being preferred to thinner women in various parts of the world, just to use one very often quoted example. I wish that this was more true, but in fact it's less and less sustainable, because while there are still differences, and these differences are not insignificant, there is a trend towards the mean, and the emergence of a global norm is discernible. The current ideal is a homogenising one, which increasingly promotes a single global notion of beauty. So think back to some of those characteristics, features that we listed earlier, a golden skin tone. So if you look at the growth in tanning products and in skin lightening products, that trend is clear. And with my other hat on, most of my work is in global justice. So at a recent conference, I was talking to a guy who spends his whole time in development in South Africa, where he was fascinated by what I was talking about and said, do you know, I've suddenly understood why I find skin whitening products everywhere I go in the poorest areas. So, just as a little aside, sorry, going off on a tangent. Straight, basically Western hair, hence the treatments to relax and straighten hair. Big eyes and cheekbones, hence the dramatic numbers of procedures to Westernise Asian eyes and faces. So the homogenising tendency narrows what is acceptable and enhances the dominance of the ideal. And while there are places where the ideal is still not dominant, there is a trend evident, and I don't think we should wait until there are no places where it's not dominant before we take it seriously. If you look at the changes over the last 30 years in Asian and African beauty queens, actors and singers, you will very easily be able to track this preference for thinness and light skin. Taken together then, the beauty ideal is more homogeneous, narrower, less variety is tolerated, and it's more demanding. This makes it much harder to resist, For instance, not complying with routine practices such as hair removal is less acceptable. It's less a personal fashion choice and more a breaking of a behavioural and cultural norm. People do resist, of course they do, but it's harder and it requires a more conscious deviation and almost a political stance, rather than just choosing a different norm. Okay, so my second key argument then is about what this is doing to our understandings of the self. So in the practices I've discussed, the end point of the ideal of perfection is changing the body, changing how we look. The body in this instance becomes an object to be moulded and remade. So it is with the body where our success and our failures and ultimately ourselves are located. Now, this is nothing new. It's a very familiar argument and one that I'm sure that you're all familiar with, particularly when it comes to arguments about the objectification of persons, usually but not always women. So here the claim will be that the viewer's gaze, usually but not always the male gaze, denies subjectivity, personhood, the self of the object, and so belittles the object and changes the person into a thing. And this isn't something that is just done to us, but something that we do ourselves as that gaze is internalised. But I want to suggest that while some of this is true, I don't buy all of that, but I buy some of it, but I think there's something else going on here, which is not just the self-identification with appearance, but a further dislocation, an identification with the imagined body, the body that I will have once I've lost the weight I need to, firmed my thighs, sorted out my hair and removed my wrinkles, so that the true self gets identified with the imagined person I will be at the end of this process. So, identified not with the inner, but with the physical body, but a step further with the physical body aspired to. So this is a kind of almost a reverse dualism or a double dualism. Instead of me being an embodied self, which looks outward from the inner, then identification with the body as an observed object, but not with the flawed body I have, but with the ideal body, which I would like, but do not, and of course, can never have. So this leads me to my final argument about choice and consent. And this is an argument that I've made in lots of other contexts. It's kind of one of my signature arguments. So basically, my argument is that despite the norms which we tend to adopt, that choosing something or consenting to it makes very little difference to the extent to which it is ethical. So this is, of course, a controversial argument, because we assume that it's okay to do something as long as we've chosen it or consented to it. I think this is just philosophically and practically wrong. And I've given lots of papers and books on why that might be so. But in this instance, one has to look first at the practice. You first have to make sure that what is being consented to is at least morally permissible, and that that person is not in any way in a desperate choice situation. So choice cannot nullify claims of harm or exploitation. It can't make a harmful practice which preys on the vulnerable not harmful somehow just because it's chosen. So these are some prior questions that need to be asked before you can ask whether it's okay to let people consent to a process. So relying on consent alone doesn't work, but it does lead us astray because it allows us to think that people are being treated well, or at least ethically. That they are not unduly constrained, even when they may be, but in ways which it's hard for consent to recognise. So often, policymakers, politicians and lawyers focus on making sure that we have good quality consent, thinking that this is enough. They focus on three things. Are we fully informed? Do we know the risks and benefits? Do we have the capacity to consent, things like age, maturity, cognitive ability? And are we free from coercion and inducement? So when it comes to cosmetic surgery, a standard ethical view would be that as long as these conditions are met, then it's all okay. Not surprisingly, I have a somewhat different view. So I will suggest that even if I thought all of this was just a matter of choice, which I don't, I hope that I've explained why the beauty ideal is so powerful that it makes it hard to think it's just a matter of choice. I will then suggest that this is not an individual issue at all. It's about shared norms and shared values, and these are things that we can only choose collectively, never separately. And therefore, to say it's all just down to the individual isn't good enough. What looks like a liberal approach of enabling choice, of allowing us to do what we want with our own lives, isn't quite what it seems. In fact, it ends up denying and limiting choice for all of us because less and less options are possible. Okay, so in a little more detail. First, can the conditions of consent be met? And remember, these were, are you informed, do you have capacity, and are you absent from coercion? So the first condition, are you informed, do you know the risks and benefits accurately? Now, given the power of the ideal, I think it's hard to say that one always does. As I've already said, the imagined self exerts considerable power over us. And so much so that it's very possible that we ignore or play down the risks of procedures or practices that we are committed to because of the end point, that perfect imagined me. To illustrate, think about the way that women approach breast reconstruction for health reasons on the one hand, and for purely cosmetic reasons on the other, and you'll find some very different interpretations of what the risks are. One group thinks that it's major surgery with significant risks, and the other that it's relatively minor, and it won't surprise you which group is which. This isn't because they are informed differently. Cosmetic surgery, at least in the UK and in very many other places in fact, has very high standards of information. But it's rather because of how we hear and interpret the information. Breast plants, of course, always involve significant surgery. They usually require repeated surgery every 10 to 20 years, depending on the implant type and its acceptance into a particular woman's body. But even though it's serious, breast plants are chosen by women as gifts to themselves, gifts from parents, gifts from partners, seen as investments to increase life chances. And one explanation for why the risks are seen as so minimal is the power of the ideal, the pull of the imagined self. I think this explains, at least in part, how it's difficult to be fully informed of the risks in this instance as one would be in another instance. Second, capacity. Again, I think the ideal raises questions of capacity. Now, of course, this is true for those who are more vulnerable. So hence the debates about much more regulation for allowing young girls and women to partake. But there are other vulnerable groups when it comes to body image, and often they might not be the ones you think. So stress about body image is often made much worse by triggers such as divorce, unemployment, bereavement, and contrary to what you might expect, the most common profile of someone suffering from an eating disorder is not an adolescent, but someone in their 30s or 40s. So these aren't groups that we would normally think of as vulnerable or protected by regulation in that way. But arguably, very many of us are vulnerable, especially when it comes to situations like that and with the strength of the beauty ideal. The third criteria is most questionable of coercion and inducement. Is anyone coercing us into having surgery, into removing our body hair, and into continual dieting or continual guilt for failing to diet? No, nobody is standing over us and doing this. These are things we choose, and sometimes we want them very much. For instance, when we save money and forgo lots of other goods, doesn't this prove that we really want these things? So, yes, we do. We want them, and we want them badly. But does it follow from that that there is no coercion or inducement going on? The pressure might be internalised, but that might make it harder, not easier to resist. So just because somebody's not standing behind us with a big stick does not mean that there is no inducement going on. So on all three conditions of consent, I'm very wary. Consent assumes that the choice is individual, but these values are shared. It is a collective, not individual, ideal. The fact that the dominant beauty ideal is shared matters. It makes claims that separate individual choices are enough very problematic. You can't choose your own beauty ideal. You can only choose to conform to it or to reject it. If you reject it, as some do, then there is a danger that you will stand outside the norm and may suffer accordingly. Remember the politicians. Standing outside the ideal isn't easy for most people, as the barefaced selfies show. Most women wear makeup at least some of the time, and employers and others expect it. Gradually, what is normal, what is required to attain minimum standards of acceptable appearance has extended. Given this, there is something very odd about thinking that individual processes like consent can be used to regulate a collective norm. Rather than a range of cosmetic options giving us more choice, it may be that we are ending up with less choice as the demands of beauty increase. As we saw with hair dye and body hair, the variety of choices which are acceptable is reducing. What is normal is shrinking. The ideal is increasingly dominant and increasingly narrow. What I have to do to be normal is more than my mother had to do. And Clara again. So this isn't more choice, it's less choice. And that is where I am at present. So it could be that these claims will change dramatically between now and going to press, and if you hear me in a year's time, I might be saying something radically different. But I hope you've enjoyed this quick run through of some of my thoughts on the ideal of perfection, and on a little bit, just a little bit, on how it might connect to happiness. Though as I've gone on, I hope you'll see that I'm much more suspicious of its connection to happiness than the ideal expects one to be. So maybe you'll at least go away thinking about whether more perfect really does mean more happy. But whatever else you go away thinking, please don't feel guilty. Remember, this is communal and not individual. Thank you.
If you have any questions, put your hand up.
Aren't you struggling against thousands of centuries of the evolution of human psychology? When you go back to the Stone Age, surely every young female had to try to attract the healthiest and strongest of the males in order that she herself would produce healthy and successful progeny. It's the peacock's tail, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't plan particularly to engage in. I'm not sure how much those evolutionary arguments are continuous with what's going on here. Partly because of that. So you might think, so some bits might be. So you might think, oh, youth mimicking is an attempt to still look fertile when one's not, or something, if you buy those evolutionary arguments. But I mean, I worry about talking about Stone Age because we have so little access to what that might have been. I mean, certainly it's true that throughout human history we have some interest in looking beautiful and conforming to the norms of that standard, and that's not necessarily women. In some society it's men. But the fact that appearance might matter in some sense, and it matters to be attractive and desirable to one's partner, is not quite the same as conforming to what is an increasingly narrow and difficult to see behind norm. So one of the chapters that I have in the book is about looking sexy rather than being sexual. And there is a move away from the embodiment of the experience to the projection of the ideal, and that's part of what's going on in the posting of selfies and things. So that would seem to be very discontinuous with previous norms. So there are some continuousness, and one of the things that's so fascinating about the beauty project as opposed to some of the other things, I spend a lot of time working on justice and injustice, and some of the things that happen are just really bad. So it's really easy to say ethically all bad. Now, one of the things that's so fascinating about beauty is that some of this is what we always do is very human, is very life-enhancing. So it's getting at that particular form of what's going on now rather than the other. So it makes it more complicated but more fascinating. And I don't want to keep you from your lunch. It's 1 o'clock. Do you want me to?
Yes, I think we're going to call lunch now. We've got 45 minutes for lunch. We'll be back by 1:45.